Good morning. Welcome. This is Angela Coulter, your Consciousness Transformation Ascension Guide, originator of Trinity Energy Progression, bringing you this week's Living the Shift. So I apologize, I'm running a little past the half hour today because I went to, as you've noticed, I'm posting this actually live from Living the Shift. Usually I do it from my homepage on Facebook, but moved it and then it was like slightly different and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, here we are. So I was, okay. Hopefully I can see your comments. If I can, I apologize. It's interesting how they change the screens for live streaming on like a community versus a homepage versus, other pages. It's very bizarre. So I'm going to pull it up on my phone here just in case because I don't think I am seeing any comments. Just bear with me for a moment. Here we go. Okay. So we are talking about bringing sexuality and consciousness together, part 2. So last week I started talking a little bit about the, like a lot of background stuff, like where we're coming from when it comes to sexuality. And how we've kept it so separate from our spirituality. And we think, oh, it's nice and it's just it's a nice to have, but not necessary. And yet it's interesting because, I was talking to somebody yesterday, a friend of mine who is in all this. And I said, it's interesting how, we get to that point of, oh, yeah, well, my spirituality is so important. And, oh, yeah, sex is nice, but I'm really focused on my spirituality and getting myself to enlightenment. And we don't realize remembering our enlightenment, because that's really what we are, where we are, just that we've forgotten, is what we don't realize is that the sexuality part is very interrelated, integrated, and necessary as part of our awakening and remembrance process. So there's so many, like I was saying it last week, there's so many different facets. I'm not sure how many weeks it's going to take to cover through this stuff, but I sort of feel like, it's really important because it's just been top of mind, top of discussion for me lately. And the first place we start, though, is looking at what we believe is... Good morning, Gloria. Oh, I can see the comments. Good. What we tend to do is we judge, right? So we judge sexuality, and I was talking about that last week. And if you ask 100 different people what is good and what's bad sex, you're going to get about sexuality, you're going to get 100 different answers. I mean, you have belief systems, religions, and everything else. So the important part is stripping away all of these judgments that cause us to act certain ways, cause us to hold sexuality in certain boxes of definition within our realities without actually seeing it beyond its function, which is what we think, oh, well, we're just animals and it's our function for reproduction. It's like, okay, how about we shift that perception and understanding, like I was talking about last week, to remembering that it is our raw power of creation. It is the energy of the raw power of creation that we've created here within these densities, that we use these vessels to do. And it's not just giving birth. It's not just having babies and creating new bodies and consciousness or a new facet of the divine consciousness that we birth here. It's for creation of all kinds of practices, all kinds of belief systems. Talk about how what they call sex magic is the most powerful, and it comes from that raw power. So therefore, we've been afraid of it because we have decided that, we're excluded from the divine. And as we're excluded from the divine, we have to, we're just mere humans. We're not worthy of that kind of power because we'll abuse it. That is the ego, right? So let's talk about that because we have so many layers of what to do with, what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad, right? That's all ego. Anytime we start saying, oh, well, that's good sexuality and bad sexuality, we start putting the ego into it. So what I feel like is more important is we start to frame it more in the perspective of what is the way to incorporate consciousness, like expanded consciousness in our sexuality. How do we do that here? Like, how do we embody that? And right away, in spiritual, it's like, oh, spiritual communities, like I was talking about last week, it's like we're talking about tantra and we put a pretty name on it and this is what it's supposed to be. And it's like, well, but then we say it's got to be this way. And what do we talk about in spirituality? We talk about it the same way. There are so many paths up the mountain, right? It doesn't matter that how we take the mountain, it's how we get to the top, right? That's a whole proverb, right? So in spirituality, we many of us are getting to that place of understanding it doesn't matter what your path is as long as you get there, right? And we're all going to have individual paths because we are all individual facets of the divine. So now, one of the paths or an integration of the paths have to do with our sexuality. And so what we were talking about in this conversation I had yesterday was, okay, so ultimately, what's the ultimate attainment in sex, right? Pretty much the orgasm, right? So, okay, so if that's the top of the mountain, the question is how you're going to get there. And so there's so many different ways. Now, let's talk about, there's a lot of different, the thing is, we talk about having a partner, right? What kind of partner you're supposed to have, what kind of partner it's supposed to be. Like we put all these definitions and these limitations and, like some people believe you have to be married to have a sexual partner. Some people believe you have to have, an opposite gender sexual partner. Some people believe you have to do sex a certain way, that it has to be missionary or it has to be in this position. Or if you do anything kinky, that's wrong or bad. Or if you do anything painful, that's wrong or bad. However, that's all these layers of judgment that we've put into these definitions of what it's supposed to be. And, it was funny as I was listening back to what I talked about last week, because I was like, okay, I know there's more to talk about and I don't want to keep on repeating the same thing, but I mean, it's going to overlap. But, it was interesting of last week, I talked and I just lost that thought. Dang it. I hate when I do that. Right. So I was like, oh, I forgot I had said that, but it was really a good point to make is, we have this whole thing and the religion, like belief systems have decided that your, sexuality for a woman is your purity when actually like that to not have sex is your purity and that you become dirty when you have sex when it's like really, well, not that you're dirty without having sex, but it's like you're not realized, like you're not able to realize the full extent of your power in your body until you have that sexual understanding within it, right? So, okay, so maybe we don't have sex, but what about, like, and I'm not saying you do or you don't, I'm just saying, but what about self-gratification first and foremost? So, like, you talk to 10 different people about masturbation, right? And they go, oh, and they get all kinds of uncomfortable mostly. We have so many judgments about that, right? How many times have you heard like belief systems that are like, oh, well, yeah, you're going to go blind if you masturbate and stuff like that. But I tell people all the time, like, you don't need to have a partner. The book I was talking about last week, the Magdalene manuscript, I actually found. My husband actually found it last night, funny enough, that I had lent it out to somebody and never got it back. So, but the thing is, what I love about the whole, like the second 2/3 of the book are basic tantra exercises, and they talk about how it is not important to have a partner to do it, right? So what if we took away all of these cultural expectations about what sexuality is supposed to be, and we look inside and we say, what does sex do for me, right? And many people don't know because they've been told what they're supposed to expect sex to be, right? They've been taught this is what it's not supposed to be, and this is good and this is bad, right? This is what it's supposed to be for. because up until very recently, it was like, oh no, so you have kids, right? That's why you have sex. Um, I didn't mean to roll my eyes there. That was a little slip of the ego for the moment. But so now it's like, okay, if we take away all that and we say, okay, yeah, that is accessing our raw power of creation, obviously is also reproducing, is one of the side effects of that. I'm not saying it's not, but I'm also saying it's not the only or the main. Okay. It's saying, what does sexuality do to me? So when I first was going through all my spiritual awakening and all that kind of stuff, I actually asked guidance and said, so what is it about? What is sex about in terms of this whole thing? And basically my understanding was, orgasms are what we built into the physical body to help us remember what the bliss is like when we're not in the body. So why would we deny ourselves that? Yes, Sarah writes, how can you share yourself with someone else when you aren't even sharing with yourself? Exactly. If you're not comfortable within your own body and what your body can do, then how can it be optimal no matter what the situation when you're sharing it with somebody else? Because again, it's the same thing in any kind of perception of a relationship, but we'll get to that in a moment. But going back to, that orgasm, right? So the orgasm is a doorway within to remember the bliss outside of the body. And I understand it's simply a shadow of it. So as great as orgasms are, they help us to remember that, and it keeps us going in a way, right? I've also found in Tantra, there is a whole practice, or like Tantra coaches and things like that, on how to utilize the orgasm within the body to actually use it as an opening tool energetically, right? So when we talk about energy work, I've had spiritual orgasms. I've had many of them, like where I feel like the opening is so flippin' blissful that I am about to explode. Well, that's a spiritual orgasm, and it doesn't necessarily come from down in the nether regions. It comes from the heart. It comes from the whole body. So some of the basic tantra exercises about, like, first of all, within yourself, and this is for both women and men, is pulling the energy of the orgasm up through the chakras. And I talked about that briefly last week, because that helps to open everything up. And it acts as such a powerful opening tool, to allow that bliss and that opening of our natural state of remembrance to flow through all of what we hold in our physical body as the things that hold different kind of energies for us to embody. So why wouldn't you want to have orgasms all the time? That's my question. But if we just take it down to that, right? Then we say, okay, well then it becomes a tool as part of our remembrance process. And when we learn how, we've created that bliss, that little window of bliss of remembrance in the body, through creating, like we've created the body to have these senses, and we embody the facets of ourselves that are embodied here to have this experience of saturated sensing as we've created them. Feeling, touching, smelling, tasting, excuse me, smelling, hearing. I think I got them. and holographic feeling of all of them together. It is incredible, right? When we allow that, right? And think about being in this, the only other thing that I can think that is very similar is like being on the top of a mountain in the middle of nature, and being so saturated in the senses of scent and feel and taste and smell and I said scent and noises, and just this heartbeat of connectedness and wholeness, right? So we can connect to that really easily when I say nature, right? But how about connecting to that in our sexuality? How about connecting to that in sex, in our and when we really optimize the senses to a place of full alignment of the saturation of those senses, that is where orgasms are made. So, yes, there are physical functions to the orgasm, and I'm not denying that in any way. I do know, like we don't need to have a sex ed program here on that, on the physicality of it. Um, but of course, that alignment, that huge wholeness happens when we access that full power of creation. So think about it. Okay. So physiologically, a woman has an orgasm. It creates a suction in the uterus that pulls the sperm toward it. That actually is like a vacuum, right? So it helps them along to find the egg. Where a man has an orgasm, it's to expel the sperm, right? To go find the egg. So those are the moments that we're creating life, that with the intention of creating life in the physiological form, right? So that's where we access that power. That's where we access that power. And in that power is the remembrance of that bliss. Okay? So if we hold that and saying, but that's not the only reason for us to be in that bliss is to have that power, that is just when we very, very purposefully access that power in our physical bodies, right? Because that's how we create new life here, right? So, but we have so many other powers of creation. We create in so many ways, and we've gotten so much tunnel vision on, oh, well, it's only for this, it's only for that. We have all these arguments about, oh, what should a woman do with her body? Who should, have control of that? Blah, 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 blah. And then just so much of that we've lost sight of, what? It's only a tiny little piece, tiny little piece of what our sexuality is about. So if we shifted our focus to a place of looking at where I access that, right? My body physiologically is trained to do that. What if I allowed myself to access that bliss on a regular basis for fun, right? Or for the conscious purpose of remembering my continual power of creation in all facets of reality. And then when we start to use that as our intention, right? Well, then of course we're going to figure out what it is that makes us tick. We're going to figure out that, like, what is it in the saturation of our senses that allows us to step into those blissful moments so that eventually, my goal is eventually to live completely in orgasm, like a spiritual orgasm all the time, right? That is our natural state of divinity when we step out of separation, because we limit, we partition, and so we forget how great it feels when we're out of that. So what is really important to start looking at is that in itself, right? And well, what do I do? And many people say, there are so many people out there, especially women, that have said, well, there are so many women out there that have said they've never had an orgasm. And that's unfortunate, because it's part of the cultural training of sex is only for, creating babies, and it's a duty, and there's still a lot of people who believe that. And it's like, no, sex is the gift we gave ourselves to remember our divine self while embodied, and to bring a facet of that bliss and freedom while we're in the cage of our physical vessel is such a breath of power, right? And it's not in any way, when we access it from that motivation, then it is purely a presence of being. And so, yes, there are many unconscious ways of having sex. We have incorporated all of them, or not all of them, many of them. Like we have rape, we have, using sex for power, we have in all kinds of ways. We have using it for attention. We have using it for believing others have to, like that we have to be loved through the act of sex. We have all these things and conditions that we've put on it, just like we've put conditions on love. we interchange love and sex versus saying, well, like Sarah said, how can you share yourself with someone else when you aren't even sharing with yourself? If you can't get to that place of having this appreciation and love for the beautiful, unique body that you created to embody, to be your vessel in this part of your consciousness at this point, then how do you fully allow yourself to bloom and blossom, A, into your purpose, right? B, in any relationship, because you're always going to hold something back. You're always going to have conditions on it. And then you're always going to expect certain things from the other person versus saying, I am wholly here, right? I'm wholly here as my divine self at the table. And I know what it is that allows me to embody my bliss. And together, wow, let's create an even bigger rocket, right? I prefer that. I'm just saying. The versus I'm searching for it through somebody else. I'm searching for it through somebody else giving it to me. And yes, it's beautiful to explore together. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that we have so minimized the importance of the comfort and not only the comfort, but the honoring and the honoring and the gratitude of the bodies that we created with the capability to reach far greater levels of bliss than we allow ourselves, because we get mired down in all of these other things. We get mired down in all these expectations, and then we have shame and we have blame and we have judgment, and we say, oh, well, that can't bring my body pleasure because that's bad. Well, that's when we stop. That's because we have built so much around judgment and shame and blame on sex and sexuality that we hide in the shadows with it. And so the ego puts stuff that we believe is shameful together with sexuality, and that's where we have stuff that we call deviance that is unhealthy, right? In the way that it hurts other people, or that it hurts others against nothing's against your will, but you know what I'm saying? But it hurts others because it's like having power over them in an abusive way, right? And that includes rape and stuff like that. But these are the things that we connect shamefully, right? So instead of saying, well, what's the sexual motivation? What's your conscious motivation here, right? Let's divorce this from sex and say, okay, because a lot of times people have affairs, right? And I've said so many times, and I've worked with so many couples, and I had so many experiences with just in talking with others to say, you know what, an affair is never the problem. It's only a symptom. And it has to do with so many different layers. So, we connect affairs with sex, having sex with somebody else. Not always. Sometimes it's an emotional affair. But usually because there's something, and here's the thing, something that person is unhappy with within themselves that they're projecting onto their partner, that their partner is either not fulfilling or is playing out in the judgment that they're projecting onto them for. So then they feel like they can run away, and it's exciting, and it's forbidden, right? So that makes it more exciting because we believe sex is forbidden. And so the ego says, oh, that's more, we've created this whole interesting cycle around it, right? And when we start to unwrap it and get back to the basics, right, we have so much shame connected with what, like we do when we say, oh, well, sex is bad, or it's only to be done in this kind of circumstance, and blah, blah, blah. Well, then if you want that, then you're bad. Well, then anything else that you believe is bad about yourself, then a lot of times you just group over into that sex thing. So somehow it all gets interrelated. But then we also judge people for the way they carry their sexual pleasures out. And if it is completely in a way that they choose, it is for their set of lessons. Again, it's the same thing as we talk about in spirituality, is there are all these paths up the mountain. There's no one path that's right. It's all, the point is that we get at the same mountain. So if we want to talk about that in terms of orgasm, it doesn't matter how we get there. But if we do it in a conscious manner, by the way, that path is part of the spiritual paths up the mountain. And unfortunately, we tend to limp along because we put that sexuality path on the side and we're like, oh no, I'm going to put this little toe over here, but then I'm going to, put a lot of my weight over here on this path. Instead of saying, well, but I'm missing something on this path. Well, what could it be? Well, maybe this little toe thing is a clue. It's starting to, because when we start to shift our perception of what sexuality is, and we start to embrace it as part of our divine spirit, and the part of our remembrance, then we will start treating it similarly, and we will start treating ourselves similarly, to say we built our bodies to remind ourselves of that. And the sooner we get away from shaming people about their bodies and telling them that their bodies are bad and that being human is imperfect, versus I am divine perfection because I am the divine embodied as this facet right here. And I purposely created this to have the set of lessons that I chose. I purposely created this to fit into the symphony in that very moment, in that hologram. And it is a beautiful, perfect thing because all of you are me and I'm you. And we're just different facets of the same divine consciousness. So when we have this little fail-safe of that sexuality, and we have this saturation of the senses that we've created in this physical body that remind us of what it's like to be outside, but we give ourselves the contrast of friction, of expansion, like against that vessel, right? And that's where like orgasms sort of come from in terms of energetically. So when we talk about energy clearings, like I said, when we learn how to utilize them and we bring them up through our bodies, and the Magdalene manuscript book that I talked about last week, it's a great one. And like I said, they have some great basic exercises through that. But you can look, I mean, it's categorized under Tantra kind of stuff typically, but it's ancient practices, stuff that was in place thousands of years ago in terms of optimizing our experience in the physical body. And we have over the years shamed it, and we decided it was less than spiritual. It was less than enlightened. It was less than powerful. Well, or it was to be squashed down and shamed and blamed and judged because it was so powerful, and we decided to believe that we're not worthy of having divine power of the infinite, which is really what that expansion's about. So, there's a lot of, so many layers on that, right? And yes, we can talk about rape and whatever, but it all goes back down to that. It all goes back down to the basis of what we're taught, of what we culturally are shown. And, it was great. It's funny. There's a show, it just sort of hit me. There's a show, I think it's on Netflix or HBO Max. I can't remember which one. But there's a show called Sex Education. And it's a fiction show. And it's got Gillian Anderson from The X-Files. She's the star. And it's a great show about this woman, and like, she's a sex therapist, and her son is a teenager, going through puberty. And it's like, and they live in Europe, where it's far different in terms of much less prudish than the United States. And so all the stuff about, this kid trying to grow up and find himself, and his mother has been so blatantly in his face because she's written books about sexuality and all that kind of stuff, and she's really open and out there, and he just is so uncomfortable, and yet his friends love her and all this kind of stuff. And so it's a great show. I was just thinking, oh, well, that's actually a great show. And I remember when we watched it, I was like, well, it's funny to see the difference when you're in a culture that is just like, it is what it is. And it's like so important to explore, so what it is that helps you get to that point of orgasm and expansion, and be comfortable with yourself. And funny that the mother is like, imploring the son to do that as a teenager, and he resists it for so long. It's really funny. But it's a good reminder of how culturally we have all these expectations of, what's forbidden, what we don't talk about, whatever. But what if we started talking about it as part of our consciousness from day one, and saying, well, for us to truly allow our divine consciousness to saturate our everything that we do and are here, right? Why would we not really allow that? Because it's a part of it. And we've separated out, which I think makes it more forbidden, and then we've like created all these mores around it and morality and all this kind of stuff, which are all judgments by the ego, right? So this week, there's a lot more to talk about with this. This is just like a little tip of the iceberg. But this week, I want you to look at where your perceptions are on sexuality in terms of your consciousness and your spirituality, and how where you have it separate, where you have it externalized, where you say, well, this person or somebody else or my perfect partner has to bring it to me, versus I'm allowed to embody it myself and then bring that fulfillment to the table, right? And that's where we start in terms of relationships. Because think about the difference that is when we're completely happy with our bodies. Well, then we're more open to explore and to help each other in terms of remembering. And yes, there are things that we experience with others that we don't necessarily experience on our own. And so then we can sort of expand into that in a much different way versus this dependency on fulfillment and satisfaction through someone else. Because here's the thing. If we deny it of ourselves, that's where we go back to what I was talking about. You think it's not related to things like having affairs and stuff like that. It is. And that comes from the self-work of coming from a place of self-love to know that I am worthy of being in that fulfilled state on my own without dependence on others. And it's great to come to the table as a choice. It all comes back down to that, right? So when you can do that and say, yeah, and of course it's great to be in partnerships where you're pushing each other to explore that within yourself. But this it's a key in our it's a key in our consciousness, in our enlightenment, in our coming to that remembrance of completion, because it's a part of ourselves that we lock away. We call it private. We call it, something not to talk about openly, instead of saying, well, how does this fit? What does this feel like? And many might get uncomfortable listening to all of what I'm talking about today. But it is so important for us to stop with the walls and take them down, because we're missing stuff that we can connect in our consciousness and enlightenment and remembrance by keeping them separate within ourselves and thinking one is, like keeping them in compartments. So a lot to think about for this week. And just be conscious of that. Just take notice. And I'm sure, there'll be more. There's plenty more to talk about. All right. So thank you for joining me. Have a great week. This is Angela Coulter signing off with this week's Living the Shift.